Good morning all on this beautiful morning. And when I saw that it was such a glorious day, I thought today is the day we must climb Mount Analog. So we will leave Dante. He has come out of the Purgatorio, and he will enter the Paradiso with 10 heavens before him and find the white rose and that desire and love are one. We will, if there is time this afternoon, explore a little bit of Apuleius and the transformations of Lucius. All very interesting, but I really thought today is the day for mountain climbing. Don't you agree? You feel like it? I mean, you start out because it's a beautiful day, it's crisp and clear, and the sun is out, and it's the kind of day we're likely to be able to find whether Mount Analog exists or not. So I've put on the board, this is the title of the book, Mount Analog. The author is René Daumal, a Frenchman, quite obviously from the name. He died in 1944, born in 1908. So this is he was a young person, you see, less than 40, 1908 to 1944. He did not finish this, and that's what you're going to have to do to see whether indeed you can reach the peak of Mount Analog. I will not be able to read you the full story, but because we love stories, I'm going to read you parts of it, you see, and get you started, and then we'll see what we do about how we get on further. I've put a couple of names there, but among the fragments and notes that Pierre Daumal left at the time of his death, as his wife says, you see at the conclusion of the book, which really ends with a comma, because that's where it ended. He said, she wrote, "Thus René Daumal stopped in the middle of a sentence in the 5th chapter of Mount Analog. His politeness would not allow him to keep the visitor waiting who knocked on his door that day in April 1944. It was the last on which he held a pen." Beautiful statement, isn't it, by his wife? But he left a number of fragments and notes indicating that he had planned for 7 chapters. And so you must listen carefully as we go through something of the first 5 before the tea break, and then because you're going to have to decide where we go from there, how he would have finished, how you would finish. But among the notes that he left is this very beautiful passage that I cannot resist reading first, although perhaps it comes last. But it will indicate to you whether there is such a place. As he wrote, "High up and far off in the sky, above and beyond all the successive circles of rising crests and whitening snows, in a dazzling brilliance the eye cannot bear, made invisible by excess of light, Mount Analog lifts its ultimate peak. There, on a summit as pointed as a needle, broods the solitary being that occupies all space. Up there, in the rarefied air where everything freezes, subsists the crystal of ultimate stability. Up there, unprotected from the sky, where everything burns, subsists the perpetual incandescence. There, at the still center, resides the being who beholds each thing accomplished in its beginning and in its end. So is there a Mount Analog? Well, we'll see. We will begin then, as he says, my story begins with some unfamiliar writing on an envelope. On it was written only my name and address of the Revue des Fossiles, to which I had contributed and from which the letter had been forwarded. Now, the letter is from an individual by the name of Pierre Sogal. And Father Sogal becomes the guide, at least for the initial part of the journey. And he lives, incidentally, his address is 37 Passage de Pétrioch, you see, in Paris, of course. But this already gives you some little clue, doesn't it? So be careful on these little clues, and you can already, I think, work out who your guide is going to be at the beginning, you see. Can you? The narrator, incidentally, of this whole story, you only find out at the end his name is Theodore. Isn't that wonderful? So you, each one of you, becomes Theodore, you see. Theos, the apprentice of the gods, if you like. Now, the article, or the letter from Pierre Sogal, is that he has read this article, which Theodore had written some time ago and actually had forgotten, an article about Mount Analog. And as Sogal said in the letter, until now, I had believed myself the only person convinced of its existence. Today there are 2 of us. Tomorrow there will be 10, perhaps more, and we can attempt the expedition. And so he says that he got out the article and reread it because he'd really written it, you know, in one of those fanciful moods, trying to point out the symbolic significance of the mountain in ancient mythologies, that one finds in all mythic traditions, that the mountain is the bond between earth and sky, and that in virtually every tradition there is a mountain as a sacred place, the mountain is a place where the gods dwell. It's the mountain in many traditions has this symbolism. One finds Mount Meru and the Mount of Olives in the Judaic tradition, Mount Sinai and Mount Nebu for Moses, the Mount of Olives and Golgotha in the New Testament, and so on. So that there is always this concept of a mountain, Mount Olympus for the Greek gods, and so on. The center of the earth, as I say, Mount Meru in certain traditions. In China, people have always referred to the mountains of the blessed, and so on. So he had written this article rather fancifully, and he had concluded the article with the statement that for a mountain to play the role of Mount Analog, he says, I concluded, its summit must be inaccessible, but its base accessible to human beings as nature made them. It must be unique, and it must exist geographically. The door to the invisible must be visible. But he had never expected that anyone would take what he had written seriously, that Mount Analog really existed. And yet he said, in spite of everything, some part of me deep down firmly believed in the material existence of Mount Analog. It is interesting that even when you write fancifully, you somewhere deep down you believe. So he says that he contacted Pierre Sagal and went around to meet him. This first chapter, the meeting. And he came upon these words on a sign posted next to the window. Pierre Sagal, Professor of Mountaineering. Lessons Thursday and Sunday from 7 to 11 a.m. Means of access. Go out of the window, take a left turn, scale a chimney onto the cornice, climb a crumbling schist slope, follow the ridge from north to south, avoiding several gendarmes, and enter by the skylight on the east slope. That's how you get into his apartment, you see. So he says, I willingly submitted to these fantasies, even though the stairs went on up to the 6th floor. So he finally gets there and arrives and meets Father Sagal. And he comes into the apartment, and he says that he entered a mystery, a very strange one, and he finds that Father Sagal is a very interesting person. Father Sagal had spent his early life in a monastery, which had a very peculiar custom, curious custom, and I think it might be interesting to know the custom of the particular monastery in which he had grown up. He said, every morning, our superior handed to each of us a slip of paper folded twice. One of these slips bore the words tu hodie, that is, you today, you see, Latin. And only the superior knew which of us received it. Now, your turn today meant that the brother so designed, without the others knowing it, would play the part of tempter all that day. Isn't that interesting? In certain African tribes and elsewhere, I've witnessed some fairly horrible rituals, but in no religious sect or practice have I ever encountered so cruel a custom as this institution of the daily tempter. So imagine if we passed out slips and you got one that said, it's your turn today, and you become the tempter, you see, and try to get everyone else. Anyway, how do you produce instruments that arouse people and so on? In any event, he explains all of this to Theodore and goes on about the idea that he now really has always believed that there was a higher and unknown strain within the human race. He said he couldn't take this simply as allegory, that he really believed there was a higher and unknown strain. Experience had proved, I told myself, that a man cannot reach truth directly, nor all by himself. An intermediary has to be present, a force still human in certain respects, yet transcending humanity in others. Somewhere on our earth, this superior form of humanity must exist, and not utterly out of our reach. And perhaps they would live on Mount Analog, you see. So he says, where was I to look? Where could I begin? I'd already covered the world, poked my nose into everything, into all kinds of religious sects and mystic cults. But with all of them, it came down to the same dilemma. Maybe yes, maybe no. Why should I stake my life on this one rather than on that one? You see, I had no touchstone. But the very fact that there are now two of us changes everything. The task doesn't become twice as easy. After having been impossible, it has become possible. It's as if you first gave me, in order to measure the distance from a star to our planet, one known point on the surface of the globe. You can't make the calculation. Give me a second point, and it becomes possible, for then I can construct the triangle. This abrupt switch into geometry was just like him. I don't know if I understood him very well, and I learned later that there was a tiny error in his reasoning, but it had a forcefulness that convinced me. So he continued, your article on Mount Analog enlightened me. The place exists. Both of us know that. Therefore, we'll discover it. Where? That's a matter of calculation. In a few days, I promise you, I'll have determined its geographic position within a few degrees. And you're ready to start out right away, aren't you? And so Theodore says, yes, but how? By what route? By what means of transportation? With what money? You know, isn't this what we all do? And if I say to you, you see, I said this morning we're going to start our climb of Mount Analog. You probably didn't wonder how or where. I mean, I could have said, "Lon, let's get out of here. Come on, follow me out." You know, you'd say, "Well, wait, I have to collect a few things, and I didn't bring the right walking shoes, and I'm not quite ready," and so on. But, says Father Pierre Sogol, those are all details. Furthermore, I'm sure we'll not be alone. Two people convince a third, and it all snowballs, even though we'll have to reckon with what people call common sense. It's, you see. So, therefore, he now is all ready, and they agree that they will bring a few people back the next day, and that he would, they'd begin to collect an expedition. And so he, of course, then has to go out the window. He shows them the little window out of which hung the rope, and he said, using the rope, which smelled of grass and stables, I reached the ground in a few moments. And so he is back home. And so he's about now, he says, that is how the plan for an expedition to Mount Analog was born. Now that I have started, I shall have to tell the rest. How it was proved that a hitherto unknown continent really existed, with mountains much higher than the Himalayas, how it happened that no one had detected it before, how we reached it, what creatures we met there, how another expedition, pursuing quite different goals, barely missed destruction, how we have begun little by little to put down roots, so to speak, in this new world, and how, nevertheless, the journey has barely begun. On high, remote in the sky, above and beyond successive circles of increasingly lofty peaks, buried under whiter and whiter snows, in a splendor the eye cannot look on, invisible through excess of light, rises the utmost pinnacle of Mount Analog. So there we have the meeting. Now, he returns then the following Sunday at 2 in the afternoon. I brought my wife to this apartment. It's an amazing apartment. I skipped some of the description of his apartment, which is really quite an incredible place in which there are little passageways and plants and little animals and an aquarium and signs all over the place that trace the whole history of the evolution of humanity and the evolution of the species and so on. But we had to skip that. But he brings his wife to the laboratory in the Passage du Patriarche. And after half an hour, the three of us formed a group for which the impossible no longer existed. And various ones, in fact, there come to be, first of all, there are 12 people, and then 6 of them drop out, and I won't go into the ones that are left and their names. They're rather interesting people who finally take up this journey. And at this point, you see, Father Sogol begins after everyone's introduced. Most of you already know how I've been able to limit the area of investigation in a first approximation. But one or two of you are not yet informed. Of course, none of them are informed, but this is a clever way he always has of doing this. So he says, I'll go over my calculations. At that point, he gave me a roughish and forceful look, demanding my complicity in this adroit falsehood. For naturally, everyone was still in the dark. But by this simple ruse, each person had the impression of belonging to a minority, of being among one or two not yet informed, felt himself surrounded by a convinced majority. This is a marvelous way, you see. One of you, two of you don't yet know, and so you feel you're definitely the minority. And that means you look at your neighbor and you're probably pretty wise. You probably already know, you see. This simple method of Sogol's for getting the audience into the palm of his hand, I thought this is wonderful, you see. Any of your lecturers, you better follow this, you see, method of saying this. I always do it, I must say. I always say, you all have read the Odyssey, haven't you? But I didn't ask how many had read of it, but you all think that, well, my neighbor probably has, and how stupid that I haven't, and so I haven't read it for many years myself, in one sense, but I'm rereading it. Anyway, this simple method of Sogol's for getting the audience into the palm of his hand, as he phrased it, was a simple application of the mathematical method that consists in considering the problem as solved. And he also used the chemical analogy of a chain reaction. But if this ruse was employed in the service of truth, could one still call it a falsehood? In any case, everyone pricked up his ears. I'll sum up the premises, he said. Firstly, now be careful here. You see, these are the suppositions. Mount Analog must be much higher than the highest mountain known today. Its summit must be inaccessible by means known up to now. But secondly, its base must be accessible to us. And its lower slopes must already be inhabited by human beings similar to us. For it is the path which links our present human domain to higher spheres. Inhabited and therefore habitable. Therefore characterized by a set of conditions including climate, flora and fauna, and cosmic influences of all sorts, not too different from the environment of our own continents. Since the mountain itself is extremely high, its base must be fairly broad. We are dealing with an area at least as large as that of the Earth's largest islands, New Guinea, Borneo, Madagascar, perhaps even Australia. I've been hunting around Australia to see if I could discover it, so I decided to come to New Zealand and see if it were over here. See. If we agree to this much, three questions arise. How has this territory thus far escaped the notice of explorers and travelers? How does one gain access to it? Where is it? The first question appears to be the most difficult to answer. How can it be that there exists on our Earth a mountain higher than the highest peaks of the Himalayas, and that no one has as yet observed it? However, we know a priori, by virtue of the laws of analogy, that it must exist. To explain why no one has yet observed it, several hypotheses can be offered. First, it may be located on the continent of the South Pole, which is still little known. But by taking a map of the points already reached on this continent and calculating through a simple geometrical construction the space which the human eye can embrace from these points, you can demonstrate that no elevation of more than 25,000 feet could have gone unnoticed, no more in this region than in any other part of the planet. The argument struck me as being based on pretty debatable geography, but fortunately no one noticed. So goes on. Are we dealing with a subterranean mountain then? Certain legends, which have been handed down principally in Mongolia and Tibet, allude to an underground mountain, the seat of the king of the world, where the ancient knowledge is preserved like an unperishing seed. But this realm does not correspond to the second condition of the mountain's existence. It could not afford a biological environment sufficiently close to ours, and even if this underground world exists, it is probably located beneath the slopes of Mount Analog. All hypotheses of this order being inadmissible, we now have to put the problem differently. The area we seek must be able to exist in any region whatsoever of the Earth's surface. Therefore, we must conclude under what conditions it remains inaccessible, not only to ships, airplanes, and other vehicles, but even to eyesight. I mean that it could perfectly well exist, theoretically, in the middle of this table, without our having the least suspicion it was there. To make myself understood, let me demonstrate an analogous case. And he brought in from the next room a plate, which he placed on the table, into which he poured some oil. Then he tore up a piece of paper into tiny fragments, which he tossed on the surface of the oil. I have used oil, he said, because its high viscosity allows me to demonstrate my point more easily than with water, for example. Assume the surface of the oil is the surface of the earth. This smaller piece, this piece of paper, a ship. This piece of paper, a continent. So we have a continent, a piece of paper is a continent, a smaller piece is a ship. With the point of this needle, I'll push the ship gently towards the continent. You see that I can't make it touch or overlap. When it comes within a few millimeters of the shore, it seems to be repelled by a ring of oil enclosing the continent. Of course, by pushing a little harder, I can make them touch. But if the surface tension of the liquid were great enough, my ship could sail right around the continent without touching it. Now suppose that this invisible structure around the continent repels not only so-called material bodies, but light rays as well. The navigator aboard the ship will sail around it, not only without touching it, but without even seeing it. You know, incidentally, let me interrupt here. You know, this is one of the minor siddhis. You can make yourself invisible anytime you want to. You know, just somebody walking down the street and you don't want to see them, make yourself invisible. Just deflect the rays of the sun from you, and you're invisible. Very simple. Now, the analogy, he says, becomes a bit too crude now, so let's put it aside. So, however, I imagine you know that a body does not, in fact, exercise a repellent action of this kind on rays of light which pass close to it. This fact, predicted by Einstein, was verified by the astronomers Eddington and Crommelin on 30th March 1919 during a solar eclipse. They established that a star can be still visible even when, in relation to us, it has passed behind the solar disk. Doubtless this deviation is minute, but may there not exist unknown substances, unknown for this very reason, in fact, capable of creating around them a much stronger curvature of space. It touches a bit between the minor and the major siddhis, you know, of learning how to curve space around you. So he says it must be so, for it is the only possible explanation for our ignorance of the existence of Mount Analog. This, then, is what I have established simply by eliminating the untenable hypotheses. Somewhere on the earth, there exists an area with a circumference of at least several thousand kilometers, and out of which Mount Analog arises. The substrata of this territory are composed of materials which have the property of inducing curvature in such a way that the region is enclosed in a shell of curved space. So can you visualize this, you see? Where do these materials come from, you see? Well, that's really not so essential. He really doesn't know, he says, but we'll find out sooner or later when we get there. I can further deduce that this shell cannot be completely closed. It must be open above in order to receive radiations of all kinds from the stars, essential to the life of ordinary man. And it must encompass a considerable portion of the Earth's mass. And he has a small diagram, which is I started to put on the board, but you see here is the curvature of space, but it's open from above, you see. And he said, therefore, he can show the path of the light rays. That, after all, we know space is curved. Einstein told us that, you see. And so here is this sort of curvature of space, and within it the mountain. But he says this opening out must take place at so great an altitude, far greater than the depth of our atmosphere, that it would be no use trying to enter the shell over the top in an airplane or balloon. If we visualize the area horizontally, then we have another kind of vision of it. Goodness sakes, half an hour is gone already. Oh dear. But it's important to really find out, you see. Here is Mount Analog in the center, and it's on this continent, you see. And around it, all the way around it, is this invisible shell, so to speak, you see. Now, how is a ship going to get from A to B, you see, without passing through it, you see? So we have to see that this distance from A to B is as though it's the same, because the curvature of space. So he said it's a matter of a closed ring of curvature, spacious and impenetrable. This is the closed ring around the continent in which Mount Analog is present, which surrounds the country at a fixed distance with an invisible, intangible rampart.